Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Joshua Gonzalez, and I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. So in collaboration with World Learning, we are very excited to bring to you a great virtual program here today. I'm joined by our wonderful speaker, Mr. Elbridge A. Colby. He'll be sharing his thoughts on the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war on Indo-Pacific geopolitics. I'm also delighted to be joined today by our moderator for the event, Ms. Yuki Tatsumi. Before we begin, I'll be going over a few administrative items. First of all, this program is on the record and it will be recorded. The speaker and the moderator are not employees of the U.S. government, so their remarks and expertise do not represent the official policy of the U.S. government. Also, today's program will be conducted with simultaneous English and Japanese interpretation. Please scroll to the bottom of your screen, click the interpretation button, and select the language that you would like to use to listen to today's program. Captioning for today's program is also available in your web browser. Instructions can be found in the chat box. Following today's discussion, we will open up our session for questions and answers, and we invite you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box. You can submit your questions anonymously, and you can submit them in English or Japanese. So without further ado, I would like to pass it over to the U.S. Embassy Tokyo's Minister Counselor for Public Affairs, Philip Roskamp, who will make some opening remarks. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. And good morning from Tokyo. Ohayou gozaimasu. 1 year ago, last week, in fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an illegal war in Ukraine. That Russian aggression has killed thousands, injured 10,000s more, and destroyed civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. This barbaric and unprovoked invasion has shocked the world, but it has also created a unique moment of unity. On 2 occasions, including just last week, more than 140 countries around the world voted at the UN General Assembly to condemn Russia's illegal war. Over the past year, in an attempt to protect national sovereignty and values enshrined in the UN Charter, Indo-Pacific countries have become more connected to Europe, and European countries have become more connected to the Indo-Pacific. Here in Japan, I think Japanese who really believe strongly in the value of international law and the international system were shocked at President Putin's invasion. I think it's caused a broader rethink of how authoritarian regimes might resort to force in pursuit of their national objectives. You know, Beijing is only 2,092 kilometers away from Tokyo, and Taipei is only 2,093 kilometers away from Tokyo, according to Google. Naha and the Southwest Islands are even closer. So a potential conflict in Taiwan would have massive consequences on Japan, the United States, the entire Indo-Pacific region, and the world. You know, Prime Minister Kishida himself, both here and in international fora, has highlighted this growing connection between the growing strategic connection between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. For understandable reasons, there's a lot of focus on the military aspect of this conflict. How many troops, what weapon systems, how many planes and tanks, but we can't lose sight of the fact as well that Russia's war is more than an assault on the Ukrainian people. It's an assault on the values and principles that are shared between nations who believe in the rule of law. Authoritarian disregard for international law is an attack on the very foundation that underpins how nations of the world peacefully coexist with each other. So with that in mind, it's a pleasure to welcome this morning, albeit virtually, Mr. Elbridge Colby, a top American security and strategic thinker, to discuss the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on Indo-Pacific geopolitics, drawing parallels to Taiwan. I'm also delighted to welcome who I've never met in person, but only virtually, Ms. Yuki Tatsumi from the Stimson Center as moderator. She is one of the leading voices on US-Japan relations back in the United States. I look forward to a great conversation. Josh, back over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Philip. With that, I will do a brief introduction here of our wonderful speaker and moderator. Mr. Albert Colby is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative and the author of The Strategy of Denial, America Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, which the Wall Street Journal selected as one of the top 10 books of 2021. Previously, Colby was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. In that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Today's moderator is Ms. Yuki Tatsumi. She is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, Tatsumi-san worked as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as the Special Assistant for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Ms. Tatsumi. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you for the reminder. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Philip, and for this kind introduction. And good morning for those of you who are channeling to this program from Japan. And if any of you are channeling in from the United States, good evening. I am delighted to have, we'll be spending next hour and a half or so with my good friend Bridge to talk about a whole host of issues that Indo-Pacific region and Japan in particular is facing in the 1 year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Bridge, great to have this opportunity with you. COVID lockdown made us easier actually to connect on a screen, but I can't even remember when I saw you last time in person, but it's great to see you. I know, too long, right?
Well.
So great to see you still in that format. So I would have just thank a U.S. Embassy for giving us the opportunity to reconnect as well. So let's get right into the conversation, Bridge. So toward the end of 2021, you published the
大変面白い本、この指定の戦略という本を書かれました。その抑止力の未来、それから、原子力、関係、核兵器など、も含めて、語られました。そして、その数ヶ月後にロシアが、
So if you can to start us off with this conversation, what you think this Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed? What still stays the same? And especially in the light of your very recent, very interesting tweets that you talked about U.S. Possibly facing another prolonged war in Europe, while it's still semi-bogged down in Middle East. How do you think they will all affect the strategic landscape in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, thank you, Yuki. It's great to see you, my friend. And thank you to the U.S. Embassy and World Learning for the kind invitation. It's really an honor to be appearing in this format with what I genuinely think is the U.S.'s most important ally in Japan. So really a pleasure. And thanks in particular to Joshua and Philip for hosting me here. What has changed and what has stayed the same with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I would say probably the biggest thing, and Philip touched on this, is what has changed is the mindset of people in the post-war and particularly post-Cold War period. I think that the idea of a major war basically in one of the developed areas of the world was seen as, if not quite inconceivable, very remote possibility. My friend, I think I could say, and former, a mentor of sorts, Robert Jervis, the very prominent international relations scholar, he argued that Europe had become a kind of security community, that it was unthinkable that a major war would happen there. And that has now been shown to be incorrect, that very tragically, a major war is possible. And so with my book and earlier in my work in the Pentagon on the National Defense Strategy, one of the things we were trying to do is convince people that this is a serious possibility and we need to prepare for it. But sadly, the best illustration of that point is the outbreak of war on the continent. What has not changed, and I fear we are missing the point, is that Asia remains the primary theater of the world. In the 15th century, China was the central empire. Most of world economic activity was still in the Far East. Over the course of the modern period, the center of global economic activity and political power shifted to Europe and the North Atlantic area, such that by the 20th century, most of the world was controlled directly or indirectly from Europe and North America. That is no longer the case anymore. Now, greater than 50% of global GDP will be clustered in Asia, and China, along with the United States, will be one of the two superpowers, and eventually India will be as well if it continues on its current growth trajectory. I think this is the part that is not appropriately appreciated in the discussion in Washington, certainly in Europe, and to some extent even among allied capitals in Asia. Europe is no longer the center of the world. So I think this is the very important part, and particularly because China is still the most important challenge to U.S. interests, and I think certainly Japanese interests, as has rightly been laid out in the national security strategy and national defense strategy of the government of Japan. But we're not acting that way. So my book, which I will take the liberty of saying is supposed to come out in Japanese, I hope this year, from Nikkei. I think that it remains unfortunately very current because we are not yet, both the Americans and I think that Japan itself, are not yet putting enough emphasis on the primacy of the challenge from China.
Interesting, thank you. So dovetail to that question, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, how the United States reacted, how the NATO reacted, and how the international community rallied around Ukraine eventually, that made a lot of people, certainly that I know of in Japan, about what if similar situation happens in Taiwan Strait. So from your or even in Korean Peninsula. So from your perspective, what are the potential similarities and differences if this kind of conflict occurs in the Northeast Asia side of the world?
Right. Well, I'll put to the side North Korea for the moment, which is a serious challenge, but pales in comparison to China.
Right.
I think there are some similarities between what is happening in Europe and Ukraine and what could happen over Taiwan. But I think there are a lot of dissimilarities that are more important to recognize right now. The most important is that China is 10 times the economic scale of Russia. Its industrial base and economic resources are an order of magnitude larger. We don't know about the performance of the PLA, but it stands to reason to think that the Chinese, who are operating at the forefront of human technological development, would probably be more capable than the Russians. At the same time, the other countries in Asia are about half of Asia's economic weight. So if you divide Asia, which itself is roughly 40 to 50% of global GDP, China is half of that fraction. In Europe, Russia is a small fraction, probably less than 10% of European GDP or something thereabouts. So China is much stronger relative to the rest of Asia than Russia is to Europe. This makes it much more dangerous. In the particular case of Taiwan, the major advantage that Taiwan has, and Taiwan, of course, is critical to the defense of Japan. The major advantage that Taiwan has is it's separated by 100 miles of water from the mainland. Of course, if it had not been, it would have fallen to the communist Chinese a long time ago, but it has 100 miles of water. Ukraine does not. Other than that, it is a worse situation. Taiwan is very small compared to China. It's about 1/75th the size. Ukraine is about 1/3 or 1/4 the size of Russia in terms of population. Ukraine is a huge area. Taiwan is this very small area, so an invader would have much more potential. Moreover, Ukraine borders Poland and Romania, which makes it easy to resupply. Taiwan would be very difficult to resupply in the event of a conflict. Moreover, I think the Chinese have probably learning lessons from the conflict. And I think the biggest lesson is, if you are going to attack, leave nothing to chance. Make sure you do it correctly. I think if Xi Jinping is learning the lesson, he says Vladimir Putin assumed that Ukraine would fall apart. He assumed that he would be able to kind of quickly take over the country. And that has resulted in a catastrophe, fortunately, for Moscow. So if you're Beijing and you are going to roll the dice, you're going to make sure that you're successful. And that means a much more devastating attack, not only against Taiwan, but I think also against US forces in the region and Japan. I think that the Chinese Admiral Studeman, the head of naval intelligence, said this the other day. I think the Chinese assume the Americans and probably now the Japanese are going to come to Taiwan's defense, which means if the Chinese are going to go to war, they're going to strike first, probably, because that's the smart thing to do in that context. And I think the Chinese are smart. So I think the situation is much more severe in Asia than it is in Europe, even though there's a war going on in Europe.
And as we all know, former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan last year. And ever since, really, China is doubling down on its pressure on all fronts vis-a-vis Taiwan. And then I remember at that time, and then I read the couple of media interviews that you did with Asia media outlets that was critical of the speaker's visit. Decipher us, and especially now that the Republicans have the majority of the House, and they are already talking about it's not if, but the matter of when the current Speaker McCarthy might visit Taiwan. And they also formed the, I guess, a joint select committee on the strategic competition with China. And some key, I did hear, I was on the discussion with one of the key members of that committee who said the chairman's this was on the record, so you can probably see it on the, on the record somewhere. But the chairman's hope is to have a hearing in Taipei for that committee. If something with that happened, it would be quite provocative. Talk us through how, what do you think of all these, very forward-leaning attitude amongst the, U.S. Congress vis-a-vis Taiwan? Would it help the situation? Would it actually aggravate the situation?
So my general view is that we are better off speaking softly and carrying a big stick. So fewer symbolic acts and more acts to strengthen our military position. I think that we are risking a situation in which we are drawing attention and sort of beating our chests in a very public display of symbolic commitment to Taiwan, but we are not doing the things necessary, and Taiwan is not doing the things necessary to ensure a solid defense of Taiwan. So I don't mind in principle provoking Beijing. What I object to is provoking Beijing from a position of weakness and giving Beijing a political opportunity to respond. But also, we are in a very delicate situation. The fact of the matter is that whether we like it or not, China does genuinely regard Taiwan as a renegade province and part of China's inheritance. We may disagree with that or have different views, but that's the fact. And there are 1.4 billion Chinese. They're much richer than they used to be. They have an incredibly powerful military. We must take that seriously. So my view is to downplay the symbolic efforts and really focus on, you say in English, kind of English, a colloquial term, hitting the gym. We need, God forbid, we don't want there to be a boxing match, but if there is a boxing match, we want to be as ready as possible. And instead of getting in front of the microphones and hurling insults at our potential opponent, we should be in the gym working out. And this is the problem, and this is a bigger problem with our entire American discussion that I think the Japanese government candidly is not pushing back on enough, is that we are sort of have this idea that this is still 1999, that this is still a world in which nobody can realistically challenge us. And, look, I don't think that the Chinese would be wise to take on the Americans, but I also think this is not Iraq in 2003. This is not Kosovo, This is the most, Senator Cotton said in an op-ed today, an interview,
が言ってましたけれども、もしかしたら一番その 大きな敵になるかもしれないと。でもそういうふうな態度をアメリカは取っ
All need to change our mindset before it's too late because nobody knows if whether Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership will order an attack, but they're building up a huge military that's specifically designed to take on the United States and Japan and Taiwan. We know that from satellite imagery and so forth. That's publicly available. And Xi Jinping openly says, and the US intelligence community now states, that China wants the ability. Xi Jinping has given the PLA the order to be ready to invade and occupy Taiwan by 2027. That doesn't mean that he is going to order it, but that's pretty worrying. I mean, if somebody says he's getting ready to kill you in a few days, you're not sure he's going to kill you, but you're probably going to take it seriously, right? Like people don't say they're going to kill you and you just ignore it. So, I mean, that's the world in which that's the focus that we need to have.
So in light of that, sounds like basically alliance and partnership in this region. Like you mentioned, I don't think any one country in the region, including the United States, can counter this threat alone. So alliances and partnership will be even more important. So from that perspective, you mentioned in your earlier response to my question that there are more specific things that US should be doing with Taiwan instead of speaking, in front of the big, with a megaphone about what we're about to do. Tell us about what your ideas on some of those specifics that you would like to see more.
Taiwan, the most important thing for Taiwan to do is to reshape its military to focus on what's called an asymmetric defense, basically a defense against invasion or blockade, to shape it away from a military that looks like a smaller version of the American military to one that is focused on anti-ship missiles, air defense, cyber capabilities, anti-amphibious forces, these kinds of things. They know what to do, and we know what to do. Admiral Lee Shi-min, the former chief of defense of Taiwan, has laid out arguments for this very eloquently and practically. Unfortunately, Taiwan has been resistant to do so. I also think Taiwan needs to spend dramatically more on defense. I mean, and this, I think, holds also true for Japan to a lesser degree. I mean, the Chinese are openly talking about re-education of people on Taiwan, and they're openly talking about invading and occupying the country. And Xi Jinping has crushed Hong Kong's liberties. So my view is, the American people are not going to commit suicide to defend Taiwan. The American people will help defend Taiwan. I believe directly we should, but Taiwan needs to do its part. And unfortunately, they live next to a superpower giant that wants to eat them up. And I didn't create that, but that's the reality. And so, when Taiwanese people say, I don't want to spend more on defense, I mean, at the end of the day, they don't need to make excuses to the Americans. They need to deal with the reality of what the Chinese can do to them. And, they are risking their own lives, I would say, because Xi Jinping is developing a military to take it over. And if it becomes too difficult, the Americans will either fail or give up. And if I were on Taiwan, I would either support dramatically higher defense spending or I would leave. Right? I mean, when we were talking about, I grew up in Asia, when I was living in Hong Kong as a boy, there were people who would have dual citizenship because they knew that the Chinese were going to come in 1997. That was a much different China. That was Jiang Zemin's China. But they didn't know, they weren't sure. So if you're on Taiwan, or maybe they're prepared to live under the PRC, maybe that's what they're thinking. But I think if you're somebody affiliated with the DPP, or you have independent, or you're opinionated on social media, you are going to be in real trouble. I don't think Xi Jinping and the Leninist party state that he runs is going to allow Taiwanese people with independent views to float around People's Republic of China. I mean, look how quickly the Chinese cracked down on the COVID protests a couple of months ago. So that's what Taiwan needs to do. It doesn't matter whether Paraguay or Kiribati or Papua New Guinea recognizes Taiwan. It doesn't matter whether Taiwan is independent or not formally. I don't think we should recognize an independent Taiwan. What matters is whether Taiwan survives in practice as an autonomous country. And of course, this is critical to Japan because in a way, Taiwan is part of the Japanese archipelago. It's basically part of the large, string of islands. If China seizes Taiwan, Japan is in much greater danger. Not to mention because as part of a seizure of Taiwan, it would probably involve the defeat of US and Japanese forces in the Western Pacific. And I expect if China went that far, it would try to resolve other issues.
Thank you. So you mentioned about the Japan also needs to hit the gym in your words. Japan, as you know, and as we all know, is undergoing the significant transformation with respect to its national security strategy, but also as well as defense strategy and defense buildup. They released the 3 new strategic documents, national security strategy, defense strategy, and defense buildup plan, and all of which collectively demonstrates what seemed to be their real commitment to enhance their own defense capability, and raising defense spending to 2% of GDP is part of that mix. And although, what gets most media attention is, counter-strike capabilities. But then other part of this document is that I noticed was they really do talk about resiliency of the force and the importance of the logistics, the area that have been often overlooked in the past similar documents. So what does these documents tell you? I am aware that you did give an interview saying, no, 2% is not enough. You should strive for 3%. But Japan also faced the fiscal problem that like the United States have, and it's aging much more rapidly. Its population is declining. So they also have to balance that as well in a total package. So what are your thoughts when you look at this package of these new 3 strategy documents?
So I think the important thing is that it's not what I think. It's what is needed to deal with what the Chinese think. And so I applaud Japan's movement, but I do not think it's sufficient. And I don't think it's fast enough. And it's not because of me. It doesn't affect me one way or the other personally. It's that, for instance, Japan's not supposed to get to 2% until 2027. And people say, well, that's hard. Okay, I get it. But, just to take a historical example, Britain and France did not want to spend enough in the late 1930s, especially Britain, and they paid the price. There were understandable political reasons. It was in the midst of the Great Depression, but this is not a fairness contest. This is not about who has a good argument in the court of law. This is closer to the law of the jungle. With Xi Jinping, we're not dealing with a neutral arbiter. And the problem is that Japan started too late. I'm a great admirer of former Prime Minister Abe, but I wish there had been more attention going to increasing the level of defense spending rather than to, some of these symbolic issues, candidly. And that's an internal Japanese issue, but there was a lot of discussion for many years over symbolic issues on the Constitution and so forth. It would have been more productive, in my view, for Japan to have increased its level of defense spending so that we were now in a better place. And I think the main point here is the critical factor of time, okay? Because a defense strategy and thinking about defense and the possibility of conflict does not happen in a vacuum. China is going to make its assessments based on the sort of state of play of its other potential opponents. And one of the really problematic issues from our point of view is that these measures to strengthen ourselves, China can see them. So China has capabilities coming about in this decade, in the 2020s, that it might determine will be less advantageous into the 2030s because Japan is building up, the United States is finally building up, Taiwan is moving. So that will move China to have an incentive. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but it has an incentive to move. And so what I'm concerned about with Japan is that there's this feeling of like, oh, now we've solved the problem. You know, we've finally done the thing, and we can, you know, sort of, we've really done it. And it's like, no, not like, and I mean, bear in mind that China, you know, yes, you have the alliance with the United States, which is essential on both parts. But for the first time in 150 years, the United States is not by far the largest economy in the world. So this is a really different situation. I think we all need to internalize that.
That is some sobering observation that you made. And then I wonder if that is also on the minds of the Japanese leaders, especially starting from late Prime Minister Abe, but then succeeding his line was Prime Minister Suga and Prime Minister Kishida. And one of their key effort is really to broaden Japan's security partnership. You know, of course, US is the only and most important ally. It will always be anchor of Japan's foreign and security policy, but it tries to go beyond that. It has been strengthening its relationship with Australia, India, some of the key NATO allies that we have. How does the DISA effort will help, if for the lack of better words, to create if not the deterrence by 1v1 deterrence is not possible, it has to be 1v region-wide deterrence. And how is this Japan's maybe a little bit overdue but still very meaningful way to reach out and expand its security partnership, not just within the Indo-Pacific region, but then also beyond, will help that help toward building that regional deterrence vis-a-vis this very pressing security challenge.
Right. So on the whole, I think it's all to the good. It's all positive. But I think it's very important that Japan bear in mind the fundamental issue, which is how is China going to be primarily deterred, but ultimately, if a war does happen, how is China going to be pushed back and ideally defeated from seizing Taiwan and possibly making further moves in the Western Pacific area? It's not going to be through economic sanctions or political support. So, I mean, if we look at the war in Ukraine, and bearing in mind that Russia is 1/10 the economy of China, the economic sanctions have had almost no impact on Russia's decision-making, in terms of its willingness to continue the war. China is far more important to the global economy than Russia is, so it will have much more leverage. And I'll put a fine point on it. Where Japan and the United States really need to focus is on military denial along the first island chain. If we can defeat the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, well, then if we can defeat the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, we can defeat a Chinese attack on Japan or the Philippines. If we can do that, we will be able to negotiate and manage the other challenges. If we fail at that, these other things are not going to save us, and particularly Japan. And that's for two reasons. One is, I don't think they're going to work. I mean, if you look at the economic sanctions on Russia, there's been large-scale effective violations. They're not necessarily technical violations, but India, China, Turkey, Central Asia, they're picking up an enormous amount of the trade. According to the IMF, the Russian economy actually grew last year. Now, there are different views on that. And there was in the Wall Street Journal, I saw that the Russian economy is expected to grow more than the British economy in this coming year. We can argue about the numbers, but that tells us something about the order of magnitude. So imagine the incentives to cheat sanctions with China. And I mean, frankly, I don't know why we would think that many countries would sanction China. Both the Germans and the French have been very clear that they don't want to decouple. You also see that Saudi Arabia visiting, the Crown Prince visiting China. So I think it's a bit delusional to think that a lot of countries would join in heavy sanctions on China. It's possible, but they would probably be fairly symbolic, and these countries are very dependent. The second thing is, even if there are heavy sanctions on China, they're not going to force China to give up Taiwan. I mean, Xi Jinping moved off zero COVID, without any problems. I mean, he's going to manage issues internally and probably be very popular, frankly, because Taiwan is a genuinely felt issue in China, whether we like it or not. And so what I'm a bit worried about when I watch what's happening in Japan is I feel like there's a lot of activity going on with the Europeans, other distant countries, Canada. I don't think those are going to matter very much, honestly. They're not bad, but the countries that are really going to matter here, I think, are the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and then a little bit back, South Korea, Philippines, maybe Vietnam, and India in a different kind of context. Those are the critical countries on the coalition side. So I all of the joint exercises, the Anglo-Japanese exercises. I mean, the British can't project military force into the Western Pacific probably without American assistance in the context of a conflict. So actually, British contributions in that context could be net negative. So that's not really gonna help at the end of the day. And this, I mean, we can talk about this, but I think maybe just to make the point, I think this gets it. I said on Twitter yesterday here, I think the Japanese government may be making a very fundamental error by sort of signing on to the American kind of, focus and idea of Ukraine as a sort of global contest. That it's a very liberal internationalist way of looking at things, and it gets at theoretical issues. I think if I were advising Japan, I would say you need to be really realistic. You need to have a clear sense of who you can count on and what matters. And what matters is the willingness and ability to put serious military force against the problem. And the ones you can count on are America, in a sense, Taiwan, Australia. You're in such a dangerous situation that I think it's ill-advised to be banking on the Europeans. In a sense, I think the Japanese government is judging or wagering that the Europeans will pay Japan back for supporting. But I don't think that's a wise bet. The European economies are in terrible shape. They need China. And of course, now China is going and trying to offer itself as an intermediary. So it will have more leverage on the Europeans, not to mention the threat to support the Russians. So I just think that's a very imprudent bet. And I think it's more important for the countries of Asia to really emphasize the importance of focusing on Asia.
Thank you. So, for obvious reasons, this was more a focused. Our discussion has been more focusing on the more pressing and more and more explicit threat vis-a-vis Taiwan, but and then we have not really talked much about North Korea for different reasons. I mean, it's a different type of threat entirely, different dynamics altogether. But South Korea, on the other hand, it is an important piece of this, or can be a very important piece of this coalition when we look at the regional deterrence in Northeast Asia. But as you know, and as we all know, Japan's relationship with South Korea is always complicated, and it always will be. So how can U.S. and a lot of the times, U.S. can actually facilitate a better communications between Tokyo and Seoul? So how can we, as in the United States, can facilitate all these dynamics that could help toward regional deterrence amongst the Northeast Asia partners, so namely Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, and perhaps now with the Japan's new arrangement with Australia could come into play.
Right.
But how do you see
well,
that?
I think Australia is very important, and the Australians have been leading the way in a lot of ways in kind of a collective defense model for Asia. In some ways, I joke that we should sign our defense policy and strategy over to the Australians, because I think they have a clearer sense of what needs to be done. And of course, Japan and Taiwan have a strong linkage, so I don't think that's an issue. I mean, the Japan-South Korea relationship, of course, is very fraught and difficult. My view is it's unlikely to be resolved anytime in the near future. And so I think strategies that rely on a sort of full-scale resolution of the Japanese-South Korean relationship aren't going to work. And so, I think it's better to find sort of practical measures that even if they're somewhat separate, they're moving in the same direction. I mean, I think the main task for South Korea is to defend itself, obviously against North Korea, but ultimately the People's Liberation Army is also going to have the ability to use force against South Korea. I mean, if China can attack Taiwan, which is 100 miles off the coast of China, it can also attack South Korea, which is also 100 miles from the Shandong Peninsula, in Tianjin area. So South Korea is going to need to defend itself, and if it can do that, that's a great contribution, because South Korea is very important as an ally. It's a very wealthy economy at this point, but it's also critical to the defense of Japan. I mean, that's why one of the main reasons for the Korean War, why the United States defended South Korea, was because if a hostile power controls Korea, and this is why Japan has intervened repeatedly in Korea over the centuries, it's very dangerous. So, I think that doesn't require South Korea doing any favors for Japan.
Mhm.
Japan benefits if South Korea is, well defended and independent. So I'm inclined to kind of not put too much effort into trying to solving the problems between Japan and South Korea. There may be areas where the Americans can help, but there's been a lot of effort expended on this issue, and I don't see a lot of progress, frankly. Some progress, but not as much as I think would justify that much investment of effort.
Thank you. Stepping back a little bit. So like you mentioned, Putin's or Russia's invasion of Ukraine really gave the world, I guess, a renewed realization about how we all should see those authoritarian regime and despotic leader. And Japan's neighbor, China, has one of them, one big one of them. And also it's another smaller, but still another yet dangerous neighbor, North Korea, also have another one of them. So moving forward, if Japanese policymakers or planners are to, when they look at and shape their approaches toward these two countries specifically, which has authoritarian rule, no one but the leader himself knows how the country will move next. What is the realistic and practical approach that Tokyo should be taking? Obviously, upping the defense spending and accelerating the pace of it will probably be an integral part of it. But what other practical steps that the Japan ought to be thinking through?
So in the context of North Korea, I think that the current policy is untenable, because the North Koreans are developing not only a pretty large nuclear arsenal, but also ICBM long-range missiles to deliver them against the American homeland. This, I think, is going to put intolerable strain on American extended deterrence vis-a-vis, on behalf of South Korea and Japan versus North Korea. And without getting too much into it, I mean, North Korea is not a significant enough threat to the globe and to American interests in the globe to justify the loss of American cities, in my view. So this leaves a question of how Japan and South Korea can deal with the threat of nuclear attack or coercion against themselves when the United States does not have the interest vis-a-vis North Korea. I don't think this is much of a problem with China, because China is a global threat to our interests. It is a much greater threat. So I think we have a real problem there. And I think the governments in Washington and Tokyo have been sweeping it under the rug. I think the government in South Korea is correct to put its finger on this problem and demand a more serious grappling with what this requires. Obviously, we'll have to work out what that is. I think the other thing is, look, I mean, if China attacks Taiwan, and as part of that attacks, U.S. forces and Japanese forces in the Japanese islands and so forth, if you're China at that point, if you've decided to do that, you probably will also decide to make as much distraction for the United States as possible. So that the United States is distracted in Ukraine and Europe right now. If you're China, you would want to perpetuate that distraction, which may be what they're trying to do, you know, with Russia. But you might also have the North Koreans do something. So it's very much in the interests of the United States, North Korea, and South Korea, United States, Japan, and South Korea, to avoid North Korea and China being exactly on the same page. If we can somehow seek to detach North Korea, that's a problem. Now, that's very difficult because North Korea makes its own decisions. On the other hand, North Korea historically has not wanted to be completely captive to Beijing. Of course, as you may know, the North Koreans expelled Chinese advisors from North Korea after the Korean War, despite the fact that Chinese had saved them. So I think this is a complicated issue that we need to treat delicately, and it does not have an easy answer. But what we don't want is a situation in which we are stressed with a war in Europe, a war on the Korean Peninsula, by the way, possibly a war in the Middle East, the Iranians might precipitate, and then, or at the same time, an attack on Taiwan where the Americans are distracted. That is the most dangerous situation.
So when we see this potentially, you know, United States potentially pulled into 4 different ways, right? Like you mentioned, and we as the United States had abandoned, you know, 2 major theater war concept long time ago. And now, you know, we were all saying, you know, even like 1 major one and 1 little one maybe not tenable, and they were potentially facing 4.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but then, but yet, you know, what the message that's coming out of, you know, the Washington oftentimes is, you know, we're still the leader of the free world. We gotta lead, which is true. And then I think it still does give encouragement to so many for the rest of so many that who doesn't like to subscribe to other side of the
Sure.
ledger. But at certain point, does this, you know, we are still strong America message, does that become untenable in your view?
Yes, I think it does. In fact, I think that's where we are. And I think what the Biden administration, but also many Republicans will say is that there's an American phrase, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think this is a very telling phrase because walking and chewing gum are not difficult things, right? So it tells you something about the mindset. We can deal with China, that's walking, and dealing with Russia is chewing gum. No. As you rightly said, our defense strategy under 2 successive administrations says, no, we are worried about winning just 1 war against China. That's what we need to focus on. We don't have the capability to do multiple conflicts, you know, of a major kind. And yet we're acting like we are. And that is very dangerous. But you know who is going to pay the price for that? If that bluff is called, if that gap between our rhetoric and our reality is called, it's going to be the forward exposed countries, because the United States is well back. We will be able to adapt. But it's Taiwan and Japan and the Baltic countries and Israel and the Emirates. Those are the countries that will pay the price. And so I think this is where my view is that the best way to adapt our policy together, our alliance structure, is to realistically assess the situation like a business and say, this is the state of play. This is the lay of the land. It's not like it used to be. We're not, you know, in Japan, you're not Sony of 1995. It's now 30 years. In the US, you're not IBM of 1995. There's a different competitive landscape, and you need to understand that. And I think this is a real problem. And I think that the American tendency to want to hold on to this unipolar era is comforting to allies, but it is also takes away the pressure that needs to happen for allies to do more. And so, you know, Japan is doing more, but Germany is not. I would say Japan is not doing as much as it should. Taiwan is not doing as much as it should. There needs to be more urgency and more of a sense that we are all working on this together, that we are we are in dangerous waters. In fact, Xi Jinping himself said in the party Congress, we will be in choppy waters. So that's, and the other thing is, there's an argument right now, I think it is decreasingly credible, but that the war in Europe will be wrapped up and Russia will be defeated and put away in a corner. But of course, now it's becoming increasingly clear, in fact, President Biden himself said it on Friday, I think, that the war is likely to go on for a long time. The Russians are not giving up. And it's going to be consuming of American attention and resources and munitions if we don't, restrict our focus. And so I think we are at a real, very dangerous inflection point. In fact, we are already in the moment of danger. But I think this is a critical point.
Thank you. I got a cue from our host that now we're starting to accept the questions from the audience. So one of the first question is if you can put away, I know you're a great strategist, but I'm going to count on you to put on your economist hat for a moment.
Don't make any investments based on my advice.
But if China decides to invade Taiwan, what will be the economic impact toward Indo-Pacific area, including Japan? The current state of propaganda and information warfare is in social, social networking sites and so forth. It's just, mind-boggling. So this person who asked this question would like to know what ordinary citizen can work on as civil defense, which is, I'm very hard to hear this because it is not too long ago that when Japanese government does this opinion poll and what would you do if your country is invaded? Like there are so few percentage of the people who responded that will pick up the weapon and fight. And then I think that resolve that demonstrated by Ukrainians really gave them, really serious thinking about, yes, we do need to defend our homeland. But anyway.
So what would the economic consequences be? It's very hard to say. I think it would depend in some part on how a war went. I think if the United States and Taiwan and Japan were defeated very quickly and cleanly, it's possible the economic consequences could be pretty minimal because countries would accept the French term as a fait accompli, and basically a new state of play, and just say, don't destroy the global economy. This is over, move on. So that's a very dangerous outcome because then China would have an incentive to keep going. I think, if the conflict were more back and forth, or the United States was and Taiwan and Japan and Australia were successful, I think, I actually think trade could really continue between the two sides, possibly indirectly, as it does. I mean, there's basically European trade with Russia now through intermediaries, as I understand it. But I think there would be a dramatic, interruption and probably decrease in commercial exchange and commercial activity. It would be very damaging to the global economy. It's probable there would be a global recession or depression at minimum, right? I mean, semiconductors coming out of Taiwan would be interrupted, advanced semiconductors, which itself would be very damaging. So I think this is anybody who's exposed to the way I think about it. If you're investing in China, there's a lot of money to be made in China. There's a lot of American and Japanese money that's still going into China, but you have to include a sort of assumption of risk that if there is a conflict, and I think the possibility of conflict is very real. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's very real that you could really lose your investment. So I think that's the way to think about the economic dimension. In terms of civil defense, I'm not sure. I think one of the things about Japan, as the Chinese military develops, Japan is completely under the shadow of Chinese air and missile power. So it's going to be important, as you said, for Japan to have this resilience where, despite the fact that the Chinese can attack, Japan can still operate and have, air bases work and have independent supplies of energy, and society is not going to be crashed by single attacks. I mean, you look at the way the Ukrainians have survived the brutal attacks on their energy infrastructure. I think that's a model for Japan.
Thank you. Next question is pressing a little bit more on the contingency scenario in Taiwan and what we can do about it to mitigate that, reduce the risk. Is there a possibility of joint training between U.S., Japanese, and Taiwanese militaries? This is in the zone of not with fanfare, but then more practical and quietly zone. But what do you think?
I think that's exactly the right kind of idea, which is exactly as you said, Yuki, not with fanfare, low key, but designed to strengthen the defensive capability of Taiwan. And there was a reporting in the Wall Street Journal that the United States is sending more troops to Taiwan. I was sorry to see that was reported in the news, but that was a good signal of the kinds of things that we want to do. Now, that training does not have to happen on Taiwan. Taiwanese forces could train in Japan or the United States or other places and improve their capability. I think that's very valuable because, one of the things you see in Ukraine, for instance, is the ability to operate together, to understand how to use technology, et cetera. These things are very important. So if the U.S. and I think the U.S. can impart this expertise to Taiwan and Japan, that's going to be very valuable for our defense. This is where I would recommend that we be prepared to provoke the Chinese more quietly, but doing things more to hit the gym, but quietly. We're not talking on TV about how much we're exercising. We're just going to the gym together. That's the sort of thing I think is best for us to be doing.
Yeah, no need to boast about how long we're spending in the treadmills, right?
Exactly. I think we're bragging about how many bench presses we can do. Right now we're still just kind of like pretty mediocre.
Right. So switching the gear a little bit, we are already talking about this protracted war between Russia and Ukraine that is going to go on for a while. What is the basis? What will be, do you think, the deciding line that determines at some point, hopefully sooner than later, the winner of the war between Russia and Ukraine? Is there any way or any war or conflict in the past that ended with both sides agreeing on who won the war and who lost? I cannot really think of any, but you can beat me to it.
Well, this is a good, if you're interested, I had an interview along with some other people in the Spectator magazine the other day where I kind of gave some answers at some length about what how the war would evolve. My first point is I'm very humble about my ability to predict how the war will unfold. A wide range of possibilities could unfold. What I would say is that my expectation is that the war is likely to go on for some time, probably at least a year, maybe more. And there may be, offensives on each side, and sides may make progress, but there is unlikely to be a decisive conclusion, because the thing, to the question, the thing about a conflict is that to end it, both sides have to agree, right? At the end of the day. Now, it may be because one side is just so defeated they have no choice effectively, but ultimately they have to agree. And so I don't think the Russians are going to be able to take over Kiev and hold it. But on the other hand, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be able to not only kick the Russians out of Ukrainian territory, but convince the Russians to accept that. Because Vladimir Putin has made it very clear that he's going to continue the war, and he's mobilized his population, hundreds of thousands of more troops into the military, his industrial base for weapons production. He's adapting by working more closely with Iran and North Korea and China. So, even if Ukraine has a decisive victory, that's not going to solve the problem necessarily. To give an example, and this is not a perfect analogy, but, in the war in Korea, there was one side, the other side, and then for several years, there was back and forth, but relatively little change. So I think another analogy that people use is the Iran-Iraq war. So unfortunately, that seems, and what I'm hearing from people who are knowledgeable is that there's very little interest on either side in negotiation at this point. So I think this is unfortunately likely to go on.
Mm. With that sobering prediction in mind, let me also throw in this aspect. So as we all know, nuclear disarmament is a big thing for lifelong theme for Prime Minister Kishida.
Mhm.
And he will be the host of the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May. But at this point, we could talk about different ways in which the concept of nuclear deterrence might have changed. But it seems that, this lofty goal of nuclear free world seemed to be, nowhere near in sight. In the kind of context, what is your expectation for the G7 summit? Do you really think leaders can make some reference to a no nuclear or nuclear free world, or aspiring toward that goal, even given what's unfolding right now?
I don't think so. I think it's kind of incredible, as in not believable, and I don't think it's advisable either. And I think, Japan for many years has had a kind of contradictory position on nuclear deterrence. Some elements of the Japanese government and the Japanese political system are very in favor of disarmament. Obviously, there's the connection in Hiroshima. On the other hand, other elements in the Japanese system and political bodies are very insistent that the United States have a strong nuclear deterrent. I think that for a long time that was part of doing business, and it wasn't that big of a problem. I think if the Prime Minister of Japan at this point, in the face of China and North Korea, makes a big issue out of nuclear disarmament, it seems honestly kind of absurd. Nuclear disarmament is obviously not going to happen, or what Putin just suspended the New START treaty. The Chinese are embarking on a historic nuclear buildup. We need to make sure that we can defend ourselves. And I was very involved in some of these debates about 10 or 15 years ago about nuclear disarmament, and I think nuclear disarmament had its best shot in history in like the late 2000s. President Obama, people like former Secretary of State George Shultz and others, and it didn't make any progress, really. And I just think it doesn't reflect the reality of international politics. And, if it couldn't make progress even then, I don't think it's worth spending much time talking about it anymore, honestly.
So what are the kind of the message, and then following up on that, you would look for those G7 leaders to come out with in May?
Well, I think I think the G7 has already been, active on the Russia thing. So I think that's valuable. And I actually, to its credit, I think the G7 has also said some things about Taiwan. So I think, being consistent on that is probably valuable. I just don't think the G7 is the main body that is going to be relevant for dealing with the China threat. As I said, the main issue is going to be the behavior of those Asian countries in the United States that I mentioned. And, most of the G7 is still European and Canada. So, Japan is the only G7 country, which is, I think over time will become more and more sort of incongruous, sort of strange, right? Most of the economic power of the world is going to be in Asia. So, I think it's a useful body, I suppose, but I wouldn't over-exaggerate its importance.
Thank you.
At
So
least in
now,
the securities field. Sorry, in the economic and other areas, I'm not as but I think in the security field, that's what I would say.
thank you. So going back to Indo-Pacific region for a second, in this kind of an environment, Japan has its own role to play in its engagement in ASEAN. How Japan should deal with ASEAN, especially countries like Vietnam.
So yeah,
Yeah, especially in the context of what again continues to evolve, a situation in the South China Sea.
right. I think it's very important to support countries like Japan, Philippines and Vietnam. those are the countries that are most likely to stand up to China because they're most directly affected by it, in the South China Sea and in Vietnam's case directly. So I think Japan having strong, I know there's been a lot of things with the Philippines. I believe South Korea is quite active in Vietnam, and Japan might be as well. I think that's very important. And I think throughout ASEAN, many countries, I mean, I think their incentive is to try to avoid being caught, as they say, between the two elephants, right? So I don't think we should over pressurize these countries when it's not necessary, because at the end of the day, Malaysia or Thailand is not going to make the difference in a Taiwan contingency. But on the other hand, we don't want them to fall into China's orbit. There's a lot of growing economic heft in these countries. So I think Japan has been doing a good job along with South Korea and probably Australia, and trying to provide an economic opportunity and an economic balance that would weigh against the money that China has, especially now that things like One Belt, One Road and other Chinese economic sort of aid programs there is a bit of a backlash that it seems to be brewing, in the sense that countries are becoming more skeptical about accepting money from Beijing and development largesse and so forth. So I think that's sort of how I would look. But I think the key countries for the nearer term are the Philippines and Vietnam.
Then and then another country that you did mention, at least like economically and strategic perspective, that'll be more important in this Indo-Pacific, is India. And of course, US, Japan, Australia, India has that Quad arrangement. Right. But then at the same time, we always talk about India as a multi-directional diplomacy, and how their non-aligned, spirit is always at the fundamental of its diplomacy and their foreign policy strategy. So how do you see the involvement of India in relations with the issues between Japan, US, and China, and just the broader peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region?
I mean, I think I think the Indians are, I would not describe them as like a full ally in the way that Japan is, but they are, I wouldn't think of them as non-aligned anymore. I think the way that the United States and Japan on the one and India are operating is as kind of old-fashioned, if you will, allies. I mean, the United States and Japan have a similar perspective on what their top security threat is, which is China. The Indians have been pretty clear about that now. And of course, Japan has the same view. India's view is that you don't have to agree on every issue to be able to work together on issues of shared concern, particularly ones that are really important. So India says, look, and I tend to agree with them, we have a shared view on China, which is both of our priority, but India have a different perspective on Russia for a variety of reasons. And I actually think the administration in the United States has more or less worked with that reality. So I wouldn't describe them as non-aligned, because I think, if anything, the Indians are concerned that we, the Americans, might return to a G2 model, or the idea of a G2 model that had some purchase under President Obama. So I think that's, India is critical because, I mean, the two critical allies for the United States in Asia are going to be Japan and India. Obviously, South Korea will be important, Australia and others, but really just in terms of scale, it's Japan in the East and India in South Asia. So I think this will be a very, very important relationship. Obviously won't be as directly relevant in a Taiwan context, but just as as things unfold over time, and as the Chinese military and political power and economic power continues to expand, I think India is going to be more and more engaged and more important for us.
So on the going back to Taiwan a little bit again, we talked about some of the practical steps that US, Japan, and Taiwan can be doing together without much fanfare on a more practical areas. One of them, one might argue, could be on the doing more amongst the Coast Guard, amongst those three between US, Japan, and Taiwan. Because as you know, in Japanese case at least, when it comes to East China Sea, Senkaku, situation, key difference, Japan's a key in Japan's response is to basically push Coast Guard at its forefront in those gray zone situation as a means to not to give an excuse to China to start escalating. But there are various views about that because of the command relationship between Coast Guard and JMSDF and how that transfer of authority may not go as smoothly as anyone expected. But as it is today, Japan Coast Guard is fundamentally law enforcement authorities, and there are things that are very different about what it can and cannot do compared to U.S. Coast Guard or even Taiwanese Coast Guard. So as Japan look at more practical ways to enhance its own tools to push back, should Tokyo be looking a little bit more seriously, looking basically thinking through a little bit more about maybe Coast Guard also needs a reform in way of what it's currently authorized to do versus what it actually should be now start to be allowed to do a little bit more.
I will confess I'm not as familiar on the issues with the Japanese Coast Guard, but I certainly think it's a good part of the solution, especially in the gray zone context. That makes sense to me.
Great. This is actually one comment came in based off of the comment that I made actually toward the end of our conversation, that where I mentioned the this American position as the leader of the free world may be becoming more untenable. This person also wonders if the American public's interest in positioning itself as the leader of the free world is waning. Particularly as we see, recent popular movements toward more of a protectionism, more inward looking, and isolationism or Trumpism, as some people may call it. Though the current administration, U.S. administration, has indicated it would defend Taiwan, do you think that there is a possibility that the future administration might tweak that position? So I think this person is really talking about post 2024.
Right. So let me get to the Taiwan issue in a second, just a little bit different. I mean, I think this is a highly contested part of American politics. I would say I think the trajectory is towards more skepticism about active American engagement abroad. The older generation tends to have a more, their mindset is more of the period when the United States was unchallenged leader, in terms of global power and so forth after the Cold War. They tend to have a bit more of a nostalgic view. Often, I think that's borne out by the polling data. Younger people, as you go down the scale, tend to have grown up in the era of the forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crisis and so forth. And I think an idea that the United States, is a very, very powerful, but is not alone in its sort of dominant position in the world. I think that's going to be debated. I mean, my own view is that Americans should look at their foreign policy as being in their own interests. I mean, Henry Kissinger has a phrase that he says that only in America is it considered an insult to call somebody realistic, and it's in foreign policy. And you could apply the similar. Only in America is it considered, bad for the Americans to be thinking about their own national interest, right? I mean, if you look at most countries, if I go to Germany, they'll say, well, I see what you're saying about defense spending, but Germans just don't feel that threatened. And of course, the idea is like, well, Minnesota or Texas is a lot farther from Taiwan than Japan is, right? So if Americans took that same logic, we would say, we're done here. So my view is, I think that under, President Bill Clinton and under President George W. Bush, there was kind of the height of American sense of its mission in the world, that we were going to spread democracy to every corner. We're going to stamp out terrorism. And actually, both President Obama and President Trump, obviously in different ways, reflected a desire to move away from that. Now, President Obama, I think, was less shifted less his administration, but he himself, in fairness, was quite skeptical of some of these, including in the case of Ukraine, actually. I would say President Biden is a reversion to the Bush, more to the Clinton attitude, less military focused. But my own view is that it is a temporary reversion. It is a lot of it is reaction to President Trump and so forth. But I think the fundamental idea that Americans, want their foreign policy to be connected to their own interests, and that they feel that they are not, their foreign policy and their economic policy has not really served them. I think that is still a very potent idea. I think one of the things with the Ukraine war is that, Americans are not directly participating, right? So this is a bit different. And I think there's a lot of sympathy towards, as there is, I'm sure in Japan, towards people who are defending their homeland. I mean, I'm certainly very sympathetic to the Ukrainians. But I think as the issue goes on, and there's a sense, if the war goes on and there isn't a clear resolution, and it does seem to be trading against, other interests, I think this issue will become more contested. On the issue of Taiwan, I think there is not unanimity in the United States. I think there's a strong sense that China is and I think in many quarters, the primary threat to Americans' interests. That part is agreed. How to deal with it is another question, and that is different both across the political parties and within them, actually. Some people want to have free trade agreements with everybody. Free trade is not popular in the United States after a generation of aggressive free trade and liberalization, where people felt that it did not benefit the United States and American workers and so forth. So I think that will be competitive. I mean, my own view is that my arguments are rooted in what is in the American people's interests, and I believe that a strong position, especially in Asia, is in the American people's, very practically in their interests. But I think the critical thing for our allies to know, I think in Japan and Taiwan in particular, is that's a relative calculation, right? So America is not, Taiwan is not part of the United States. I mean, I think Americans rightly sympathize with Taiwan. We admire what's happened in Taiwan. But if the costs of defending Taiwan exceed a certain threshold, it will become untenable. And so it's incumbent upon Taiwanese and also Japanese to do their part, not as a sort of, not even so much as a fairness issue, but just because if you put too much burden on the United States, we're more likely to back down, right? So I think doing more actually makes it more likely the United States will effectively defend, because it will be regarded as more equitable and fair, but it will also diminish the stress in an era in which we are facing, again, I stress, a peer economy superpower for the first time in 150 years. So this is a very, very different situation, and I think we all need to change.
So we've been discussing about the danger of China more from their political military ambition to that they might get too ambitious vis-a-vis Taiwan. Another danger that has been often talked about is more about their own internal stability. Given their population almost at the brink, its economy is slowing, and many do argue that does give Xi Jinping more reason to be externally aggressive, therefore resulting into the current more aggressive external behavior that we're seeing. But how do you assess the risk, China risk, of the other direction, that its economy continues to slow, population continues, population, once its population decrease hits, the pace in which that society, Asia, is basically Japanese aging pace pales what might happen in the case of China. So what are some of those impacts that China could have, not just to not just to US and Japan, but toward the in the Indo-Pacific region?
So I think we don't know what China's sort of macroeconomic future is. I think we just can't know. And from a strategic perspective, I think the United States and Japan, rationally speaking, are best off preparing for continued Chinese growth of some scale, because that will be a stronger and ultimately more dangerous China, likely. I mean, we don't know, but I mean, a richer and more developing China is going to have more capability. So, you know, and the reason is that if we prepare for that future and it happens, we're well prepared. If we prepare for that future and China becomes weaker, we will be, you know, we will have spent too much, but that's not the worst thing in the world. On the other hand, if we don't prepare and China collapses, well, we save money. If we don't prepare and China grows, that's the worst outcome. We will be vulnerable. So, you know, the argument that China has incentives to act because it's about to go off a macroeconomic cliff, you know, it's theoretically possible. The Chinese themselves don't seem to think that's going to happen. I don't think there's much evidence, actually. And, you know, their economy is expected to grow this year. Actually, I think the figures have been revised upwards. Again, I don't know what's in the future. I guess I will say I'm not an economist, I'm not an investor, so this is not something to take very seriously. But my own impression, I mean, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal today that market actors believe that China has a lot of growth left. You know, I know McDonald's and other companies were going, and higher end manufacturers are going, and companies are going back in. I know there's a lot of Japanese investment in China. I believe Chinese trade with the rest of Asia has increased significantly. So, you know, China has economic challenges. The other thing is, you know, compared to whom? I mean, Japan has had challenges, which we're all familiar with. Europe has enormous challenges. You know, China has demographic challenges, so does Europe, but Europe doesn't really have growth. and what growth there is in Europe is often linked to China. You know, for instance, the German export economy. India is growing, but its population is also growing at, you know, sort of per capita level. It has lagged considerably behind China. South Korea and Taiwan also face demographic problems. So, you know, I don't know, but I think the prudent bet is that the Chinese economy will be very large in the future, and it will be able to sustain a very significant military. What I worry about more on the economic front is that China may perceive, and with some justification, that it needs to expand its influence to ensure market share or market dominance. And, you know, this is an important thing, because I think if you look back historically at what the goals of aggressive military powers have been, they're not purely territorial expansion. They're often an economic sphere to be able to have scale, to ensure that they're able to get natural resources. I mean, in the case of Japan, Imperial Japan, the goal was a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It was actually an area that was oriented around the Japanese economy with guaranteed markets, natural resources, et cetera. The military forces were the means to gain that. Now, of course, they took on a life of their own, but at least theoretically, that was similarly the Germans in World War I, or what the Soviets were trying to achieve in Europe. So I think that is what I'm more worried about, and this is particularly important because the Chinese appear to think that we are trying to strangle them. In fact, Xi Jinping did actually use the term strangle to describe the Western sanctions. Now, I'm not sure we actually are strangling them. So the analogy to 1941 and the oil embargo that Neil Ferguson has made, I think it is a real danger. I'm not sure it's actually that bad, because I don't think our sanctions are that effective. But the Chinese appear to think that we are now trying to contain them economically. And so they have said the period of strategic opportunity is over. So if they think that, they may have an incentive to say that, well, you know, the Indian economy is going to close off to us, the Japanese economy is going to close. Ergo, therefore we have to move. And that is more what I worry about on the macroeconomic front.
Well, thank you. I just got a cue that we're about 5 minutes off until the end of this fantastic conversation. Thank you, Bridge. Let's go back to where we started, which is lessons from Ukraine.
Yeah.
From strategic thinker like you and military geeks like me, we all are looking at the different new technology that have been used, or new employment of the existing technology that has been done in this war. If you identify top 3 of the things to watch, as let's say, for example, if you can put your hat on the Japan's defense planner, and they have this national defense strategy to work with, pretty ambitious defensive buildup plan. But then you're looking at this much more recent example of how this most current war is being fought. What are the top 3 things that you would flag as Japan's defense planner think through the ways in which self-defense force needs to be able to fight?
That's a great question. I think a good friend of mine, Jim Mitri at the Rand Corporation, has been thinking a lot about this. I know a lot of other people are. I think there are a couple of things. We're still learning. I think the ability of the United States to improve, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but the United States to share information, technology, best practices with a partner force in this context is significant. And of course, the US and Japan are close allies and are operating more together. But I think there's a lot of the Japanese military, my impression, that doesn't operate that frequently with the US military. So I think that says that's a valuable element. I think the Russian failures really show, especially for offensive operations, really show, and the Ukrainian success in the fall really show the importance of joint operations and having and I'm not an expert at this, but it seems to me that the ability to operate effectively together with a plan in a coordinated fashion jointly is really critical. And then I think even with all that, I think the importance of production capacity and attrition. I mean, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians have outperformed the Russians dramatically, but they're basically locked in World War I trench warfare, and they're just pounding each other with artillery. And so there have been dramatic moves, but like Korea, where there was up and down the peninsula, at some point it ended up, I'm not saying the Ukraine war will end up exactly like that, static along the line, but I think, even though the first Russian force has been defeated, the Russians have mobilized for more. Now, they're not as high quality as those initial forces, but, the Russians are willing to throw prison convicts into the meat grinder. And so I think the idea that there is likely to be a quick and decisive end to the conflict is important. There can be very decisive phases of the conflict that shape its overall course, but we shouldn't have the idea that we can just do it and be over with it.
Great, thank you. Joshua, I think we have
Thank
to
you.
end it at this.
Thanks,
You.
Yuki.
Thank you again, Reg.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been fun is perhaps not the right word given the seriousness of the subject matter, but a thought-provoking and interesting conversation nonetheless. I would like to give you all, both of you, a final moment for any final thoughts that you may have. So we'll start with Yuki and then pass it over to Elbridge. Any last words?
Don't have too much. Again, thoroughly enjoy the conversation. Talking to Bridge over this issue is always fun. So hopefully next time I'll do this with him. It'll be in person.
In person, amen.
Right.
Great. Well, thank you, Yuki. Thank you, Joshua, and to the embassy, and thank you to all who joined here. And always a real pleasure to be able to talk to Japanese friends and interlocutors. Such an important alliance. But as you see, my view is that it's better if we look at things realistically, and then we'll be able to come up with a better plan to deal with them together.
All right, thank you very much. So I'd like to really quickly thank once again Ms. Yuki Tatsumi and Mr. Elbridge Colby for sharing their time and their expertise with us today and their valuable contributions to this conversation. I would also like to give a thanks to our simultaneous interpreters and technicians at NHK, as well as the folks that provided our captioning service. Finally, I'd like to invite you to visit our website and our social media platforms here at the U.S. Embassy for information on upcoming events and programs, and we hope to see you in the near future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Arigatou, sayonara.
Thank you.